Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. I am joined, and it's been far too long, by Alice Valder Curran, partner at Hogan Lovells, who is our regular kind of guest to talk about what's going on with CMS, especially around the IRA, drug price negotiations, and also most favored nations. But today we're talking IRA. So welcome back, Alice. It's so good to have you on the show again.
Thanks, Jonah. It's great to be here.
So the new news, which is almost a month old at this point, and who knows how old when this will air, but is that the CMS they issued their proposed rule for the iPay 2029 part of the drug price negotiation program. So just to get some context, why a new proposed rule on something that was passed in 2022? Does CMS have to do this every year? What's kind of the is the existence of the proposed rule mean there are changes?
The answer is both. So the reason it's new to have a proposed rule is that Congress, when it enacted the IRA, directed CMS to implement the first 3 years of the drug price negotiation program for the price control years of 2026 through 2028 through guidance, not through rulemaking, which means that the rules for how to implement the program for what's known as initial price applicability, or iPay year 2029, has to be done through regulation. And now we are at that point. So we've had 3 years of guidance for iPays 2026, 2027, and 2028. We're gearing up to get ready for the selection and negotiation process starting early next year for iPay 2029. And so CMS had to issue the 2029 standards in a proposed rule format by law. So that's what's new and why it's in that form. The law requires it.
Well, just to be clear, so Congress did this in order to have sort of a trial period, if you will, where they could sort of figure out what worked and what didn't work before locking it in.
That's a good question, why they structured it the way they did. We could probably spend a lot of time talking about that. It's unclear why they did it, but they did it specifically. So this was something that they specified in the language of the statute. So this is following their direction. When you read what's in the proposed rule, a lot of it is the same as the guidance that they've issued for 2026 through 2028. So there's not a lot of new there. There are a few topics that have evolved over time or that are new to 2029, so that they did have to issue some new guidance. But a lot of what's in this proposed rule is the same as what we've seen before, or pretty similar to what we've seen before.
Right. But we're going to focus on the changes such as they are. Am I right in thinking that this is the first year that the Part B drugs are eligible?
No, this is actually going to be the second year. So iPay 2028 is the first year that Part B drugs can be in the program and eligible for selection. And actually, some guidance just came out this past Friday around MFP effectuation. So if we have time, we can talk about that. But that guidance is a little newer, but it's not that different, at least on the Part B points, from what they had in the prior year's guidance.
MFP, of course, maximum fair price, and that refers to the price that's being negotiated in these IRA negotiations, right?
Correct.
Feel free to put the word negotiation in air quotes if you prefer to.
Or just refer to it as a price control, which is something you may also hear me refer to it as.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what was a surprise in this proposed rule, or if not a surprise, just something that is different, or there's more specificity being offered than there was before. It looks like one of the big ones is this qualifying single source drug. Um, what's the word, definition, and sort of how that applies to fixed combinations, deemed biologics, vaccines. So let's talk about that.
Sure. So the news here is really a redo of what CMS tried to do in the guidance for 2028. So as a reminder, CMS identifies selected drugs. They start by saying, what is a qualifying single source drug? And then they rank the qualifying single source drugs based on Medicare spend, and then the top spend drugs they pick for negotiation, in air quotes. CMS continues to define a qualifying single source drug by reference to an active moiety in the case of a small molecule NDA product, or active ingredient for purposes of BLA or biologics products. And CMS's definition in particular says that all drugs that share an active moiety with even if it's multiple NDAs or share active ingredient, even if it's multiple BLAs, where all of those NDAs or BLAs are held by the same manufacturer, are going to be considered a single QSSD, qualifying single source drug, for selection and negotiation purposes. That has been CMS's position from the beginning. It continues to be their position. In the 2028 guidance, CMS also addressed fixed dose or combination products and said that when you have products that have multiple active moieties or multiple active ingredients, each unique combination of moieties or ingredients will constitute effectively the same as a single moiety or ingredient. And so if you have a combination drug with active moieties ABC, that is going to be considered a different qualifying single source drug from a combination drug that has B, C, D, because they are not the identical active moieties in those two different combination products. And so that was their proposal before. They've retained that. Last year, they proposed an exception to the combination drugs for, I can't even remember exactly how they phrased it, but they suggested that sort of not all active ingredients are equal. That if there are active ingredient products where those active ingredients just help other products, or maybe, it was hard to figure out exactly what they were going for, but the trade press suggested that they were really going for products that have hyaluronidase as an added active ingredient, but it certainly isn't limited to those. That in those cases, those products, even though the hyaluronidase is an active ingredient according to the FDA, it would be ignored. And so if you have a product with ingredient A and hyaluronidase, CMS would still consider the product with hyaluronidase as the same qualifying single source drug as product A by itself. CMS did not finalize that proposal at the time, but in the 2029 proposed rule, it's back. And they're sort of taking another run at that. And so that's another proposal that we're seeing, that we've seen once before, but they've brought it back this year again.
What about those other categories? What about vaccines and deemed biologics?
Deemed biologics, they talk about the clock really starting from the date it was deemed. So you could have products that weren't originally approved as biologics, but at a fixed point in time, FDA deemed them to be biologics. And as you know, under the IRA, there is a clock. The drug has to be, or biologic has to be on the market for a certain period of time before it's eligible for selection. The guidance says that clock is going to run from that deeming date. If it's a biologic, which means they're going to get 11 years till selection from the deeming date, not from the date they were originally approved by FDA if they weren't a biologic back then.
So that's kind of a win for the industry. It's a little more time.
But I would also say it is appropriate under the statute, right? Because it is, if you're going to call it a biologic, you have to go from when it was actually approved in that form.
And then vaccines, this is just a matter of like, how do you define what the active ingredient with the moiety is when it comes to a vaccine, right?
That's right. They're going to define the vaccine based on its antigen component as reflected in the labeling. And they would treat vaccines with different antigen components as distinct qualifying single source drugs, regardless of whether they were licensed under an original or supplemental BLA, using the earliest date of licensure for determining eligibility.
All this conversation about what constitutes a specific drug, what makes something one drug or two different drugs. I mean, just to take the kind of 1,000-foot lens, this is important because if you define it with too many kind of distinctions, then it starts to become a situation where pharma has sort of these loopholes where they can avoid. Well, maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but they start to have more leeway than maybe the statute wants them to have. But if you're too rigid and you're clumping too many unlike things together and saying they're the same drug, then that starts to be really unfair to the industry. So it feels like that these kind of feel like fine distinctions are really important to kind of making sure that the spirit of this law is carried through.
Well, I'm a lawyer, Jonah, so I'm always going to start with what the statute actually says. And I think what you have to start with is, what does the law say, and making sure that what CMS is doing first and foremost complies with the actual statutory language. Secondary to that, we can have policy debates about what that incentivizes or disincentivizes. But now that this is in a proposed rule form, I guess there needs to be a little bit more stringence in terms of making sure that what CMS is proposing is actually consistent with the language that Congress included in the statute.
Got it. So that's the key. And not so much like, does this line up with how the industry thinks of what distinct drugs are?
Well, I think where industry draws its positions typically from what FDA says, I do think that's relevant. A lot of, to the extent the IRA is defining drugs by reference to FDA standards, then yeah, the way FDA defines things is pretty important. And I think that those FDA standards are likely what is driving how industry views things, because that's how they are regulated by the FDA. But I think CMS sometimes takes the position that they have to follow what FDA says, and sometimes, or they do it if they choose to. But I think CMS has made statements in litigation saying that they're not obligated to follow FDA's standards. So, but I think that is often where industry starts, because that's how they run their business by definition.
You would expect that when you're dealing with one federal government, you would have consistency across agencies. But of course, we all know that's not always the case.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk about the small biotech provision, because that was fascinating to me. I don't think that one's been on my radar before, even as long as I've been covering IRA. What's the intent behind that? What's the how does it work? And what does it mean for small biotechs? That are trying to figure out how much this is going to apply to them.
Sure. So the small biotech exception was Congress's way of recognizing that there are some companies who have a very high dependency on Medicare revenue for their businesses. And because of that, the statute built in some very important protections. And in the context of the drug price negotiation program, the protection is that the drug of a small biotech manufacturer is not eligible for selection until IPAY 2029. To qualify, in general, there are two requirements, and I'm simplifying here. But the general requirement is that the drug of the manufacturer makes up less than 1% of total Medicare D or Medicare B expenditures. So the drug is tiny from the Medicare program's perspective, but the drug is huge from the manufacturer's perspective because it makes up more than 80% of its overall Medicare revenue. So really big component of Medicare revenue for the company, really tiny component of Medicare revenue from the Medicare program's perspective. And where both of those requirements are met, that drug is exempt from negotiation until IPAY 2029. So the first time those drugs could be selected is early 2027 for negotiation with an MFP to go into effect in 2029. So that's, and it makes sense, right? If you are a company and you have an outsized reliance on Medicare revenue, and these small biotechs often, are the U.S. biotech powerhouses. They're often spending a disproportionate amount of their revenue on R&D relative to larger manufacturers. They are exactly who the Trump administration would want to encourage to continue because they're already in the U.S. and they have big products in the U.S.
Now, after 2029, in the new proposed rule, there is some protection here still for these companies, but it's not a blanket exemption that they had before. Is that right?
Well, there are some requirements around what their MFP can and cannot be. So the statute includes a ceiling on the MFP for drugs in general. And that MFP ceiling is what it sounds like. CMS is not allowed to propose or negotiate an MFP that exceeds this statutory ceiling. And that statutory ceiling is the lower of, in the case of Part D, for example, the average negotiated Part D price for a particular year, or a drug's non-federal average manufacturer price, which is a price that manufacturers calculate and report for their VA FSS agreements. it's their non-FAMP from 2021 multiplied by a percentage. And the percentage is tied to how long the drug has been on the market. The longer the drug has been on the market, the lower the percentage, the lower the ceiling. Okay. So that ceiling exists in the statute. What is unique and special for small biotech drugs is they also have a floor for their MFP, which is new. And that floor certainly applies to any negotiations in 2029. It applies to any negotiations or renegotiations in 2030 as well. One more sort of background fact. Mathematically, under the statute, for certain categories of drugs that have been on the market for a long time, the calculated ceiling may be below the floor, just mathematically as a reality. Okay. So that means that for small biotech drugs, they wouldn't have a ceiling, they would just have a floor. And that's sort of a mathematical reality under the statute. CMS in this proposed rule says we are basically not going to allow a situation where a ceiling does not apply. So they're going to calculate the ceiling, and if the ceiling is below the floor, they are going to adjust, I'm putting that in air quotes, adjust the MFP ceiling calculation to try to make it a little higher by adjusting the formula. And if the MFP ceiling that is adjusted is still below the floor, they are going to put a second adjustment to the MFP ceiling and place it at the floor, such that the ceiling and the floor would be the same number, which means there would be only one MFP available for that drug, the price that is both the ceiling and the floor.
And that would be the price.
That would be the price. That would be the only price available.
I know you don't like to go too far into, the effects and the incentives, but I do wonder, and you sort of mentioned this obliquely in your write-up, is there if a small biotech is subject to different price controls than a large company, and then a large company wants to acquire that smaller biotech, it might create a situation where the economics that otherwise might make sense for the acquisition don't make sense, because the economics that the small biotech is working with wouldn't apply once it gets acquired. I mean, is this likely to, has this and is it likely to affect the market in that way, or is there just no way to know that?
First of all, let me point out what I think you're talking about, which is if you are a small biotech drug, a company, and you're acquired by a manufacturer that is not also eligible for this exception, you lose your exception. So that's you can, if you're a small biotech, you can lose the exception to the negotiation program if you're acquired under certain circumstances. So certainly that could affect the economics of that deal, for sure.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. But that's the kind of thing that crops up when you have a law that's this dense.
Absolutely.
What else is on your mind? What haven't we talked about that is key here, is important for folks to know about?
So what I was gonna pivot to was the MFP effectuation guidance that came out last week. Okay, so
right, there's even newer stuff.
There's even newer. We haven't issued our alert for that. I'll send it to you once we have. But you said at the top of the podcast that Part B drugs are new to the program, and I said they are new, effective 2028. So in a year and a few months, we are going to have Part B drugs subject to maximum fair prices for the first time. And the guidance that came out this past week was around how those MFP prices are going to be effectuated. So what does that mean? Well, for Part D drugs, this is about making sure that the pharmacies that are dispensing these drugs to Medicare beneficiaries, those pharmacies typically buy product at a commercial price, and manufacturers are rebating those dispensing pharmacies down to the MFP after the fact. And there's a whole data infrastructure that's been put in place. It's now been running for a year and a half, where the dispensing pharmacies dispense to the patient. They have to provide the MFP to the patient at the point of sale. They have to charge the Part D plans the MFP at the time of dispensing. And then they submit their data And the bill goes to the manufacturers validate the claims, and the manufacturers send money back to the pharmacies. Within 14 days of getting the claims data, the manufacturers have to issue the rebate to the dispensing pharmacies to make them whole between the price they paid to acquire the drug and the MFP at which they dispensed it. Okay. With Part B drugs, we are looking at the buy and bill model primarily, right? Part B drugs tend to be oncology products. They tend to be buy and bill drugs. And so we have to now move from rebating a pharmacy down to their price to rebating physicians or physician clinics down from their acquisition cost to the MFP. And we have to look at doing that not just for fee for service patients, or the guidance calls it original Medicare, but also for Medicare Advantage plans for Part B drugs, where Medicare Advantage is paying the provider, and then Medicare Advantage has to adjudicate that claim and then submit it to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer then submits the rebate to the provider, the physician or the physician clinic. And that is a whole new set of pipes of information and payments that have to be set up. You know, reimbursement economics tends to be pretty important to Part B providers. And reimbursement delay and cash flow can be significant to them. And so I think it's going to be really interesting that we should watch for what do the providers who are going to be impacted by MFP dispensing, what do they think about this new process? How is it going to work for them? What is not going to work for them? And a related question is, you know, on the Part D side, one of the points CMS has emphasized over and over is that Part D plans have to keep these MFP products on their formulary in some form, right? Because, you know, plans and PBMs also are impacted by economics, where effectively they're not, you know, list prices are lower, and instead of getting rebate revenue, you know, they're getting list price differences. And so CMS has leaned pretty heavily and issued guidance to Part D plans saying, we don't expect you to disadvantage drugs that are subject to an MFP. Well, there's no formulary for Part B original Medicare, right? Physicians have discretion around what products they're going to dispense. And so,
So
I'm
CMS
not,
loses that lever to
they
be
lose
able
that lever. They lose that lever. They just don't, they don't have one for Part B. And, you know, physicians are going to continue to prescribe the drug that makes the most sense for their patients. But if the process for getting that rebate takes too long, it's easy enough to see how that could affect their decision making. Some of these practices they're not all big. Some of them are small. You know, they're going to have to sign up for this program and get the rebate dollars in. I mean, we're going to go through this whole thing all over again that we went through like in 2024 and 2025 about how do we set this up for pharmacies. We've got to figure out how we set it up for physician practices and clinics, and how does the rebate and the payment process, will it impact physician prescriber decision making or not? This is like super early days. We're not even a week out, but I think that's the dialogue that we will see play out as we see the comment process, right? So CMS issued that guidance. Because it's 2028, it's still in guidance form. It's not in a proposed rule. So but CMS puts it out for voluntarily requests input from stakeholders. So we'll see what that stakeholder guidance says and what these professional societies come out and say for those physician practice areas that are most likely to be impacted by MFP drugs.
I mean, are there provisions in what's been put out so far that suggest CMS is trying to get ahead of this? I mean, as you say, it's deja vu all over again. They know what happened in 2024, so it seems like there should be some effort, right? Or are they just waiting to hear from industry?
So one of my favorite quotes, which you probably heard me use in a prior podcast, is never underestimate the ignorance of the agency. I think they have some sensitivity to what these issues are, but I do think they're aware that there are lots that they don't know about the practical realities of physician practice and buy and bill. And that's really what this whole comment process is about. Like, tell CMS what they need to know. And that's what we should really keep an eye out for when the comments go in, and to see if those physician groups become more vocal or start taking out more public positions on this and engaging with the agency.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, one interesting question that I don't expect you to have an answer to is exactly, given that this is a Biden era program and given how much turnover there's been in general in agencies, how many individuals who were working on this in 2022, 2023, 2024 are still working on it now?
100%. There's been turnover. I mean, the Part B issue is still a new one. So even if they were around, they would still have to deal with it. But I'll also say, in my experience, the people who are at CMS really care about patient access. And they are there because they realize the safety net that the Medicare program is. They are worried about patient access in regions and locales that are not concentrated urban centers where access to care really matters. And that's something that typically is a real priority for them. And so I do think that they are interested in understanding how this process could impact patient access and how they work to mitigate any risk there.
Kind of the next thing to watch for is those comments come in. But beyond that, what else are we looking out for from CMS? What's the next big thing around IRA that we're expecting to see released?
I wouldn't say around IRA. The big thing everyone's waiting for is the release of the MFN final rules for Globe and Guard, right? We have the Generous program, which is a voluntary MFN program for Medicaid. That's still open. But Globe is the proposed rule / demonstration project for MFN prices in Part B as in boy. Guard is the same for Part D as in dog. Those proposed rules have been at OMB for a while. We are waiting to see when those are released and implemented. So that is the next sort of big reveal, I would say.
But we don't have any kind of timeline for it.
No, we don't. Usually, I think there is some time limit on how long they can sit at OMB. But if they're up against that, OMB can send it back to the agency to buy more time. So we don't know. I mean, we really don't have any indication. I saw some trade press today about rare disease lobby going in and trying to get exempted from Globe and Guard. So it sounds like OMB still might be meeting with stakeholders around it, but we're watching and waiting.
Great. When it comes to those public comments, does Hogan Lovells submit comments? Do you help your clients submit comments? What's your involvement there? Just curious.
Yeah, we help companies think through whether to submit comments and what those comments should be. But this is where I'm also going to remind everyone of their sort of middle school civics class and our Bill of Rights right to petition your government. That's part of what this comment process is like. And the agency by law has to consider those comments and respond to them and account for them and what their final position is. You don't need a lawyer to submit comments. Anyone can submit comments in whatever form. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be formal. And I just think, feedback always improves the process. So whether you use a lawyer or not, if you have a view, you should submit comments, and I encourage you to do so.
Great. And of course, we're going to include a link to Alice's great and her colleagues' great write-ups on both these things, assuming the other one is published by the time we go live with this podcast. And you can learn more there. You can get into the nitty-gritty and help inform any comments that you want to leave. Thank you so much, Alice. I really always appreciate having you on. I always learn a lot, and it's a good time.
Thanks, Jonah. My pleasure.
That concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments, at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit the website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's PharmaPhorum. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.